So hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Pu Chen. I'm the co-founder and education coordinator of PSL. Myself, along with Dr. Smita Gautam, co-founder and volunteer coordinator of PSL, will be the hosts of this educational event. We greatly appreciate Dr. Miller for giving us the lecture about Socratic questioning, which can definitely be a very useful tool for us while handling the calls on physician support line. Dr. Miller is the director of the CBT program at Beck Institute. He has extensive knowledge and experience in disaster response and crisis intervention, including response to 911, Katrina, and local school shooting. This actually is the second lecture Dr. Miller gave us. On April 4th of this year, Dr. Miller already gave us a talk regarding brief intervention using CBT techniques during a time of crisis, which was very informative and successful lecture. So if you did not attend the lecture, you can find a recorded video on Beck Institute website and a YouTube channel. So today's schedule is like this, 30 minutes for the lecture itself and 30 minutes for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit it in Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. So Dr. Gautam will handle the Q&A session for us. So today's lecture will be recorded. It says for other attendees or volunteers and be able to review it later on. And thanks everyone. So here's Dr. Miller, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chang. I'm very happy to be back with you again today. And again, I think that I would like to start by not just thanking you for inviting me to be here, but thank you to all of you who are listening for the very valuable and important work that you're doing. You're all very busy professionals and the demands for your time are tremendous. And the fact that you're willing to volunteer your time to work with frontline medical people is a very honorable thing to do. And I salute you for that. And I thank you because you're serving not only the frontline medical people, but indeed the communities that they live in and that they serve. So just a word about Beck Institute. I'm very fortunate to be able to represent Beck Institute, which, as you know, is a leading international source for training, therapy, and resources in cognitive behavior therapy. Our mission is to improve lives worldwide through excellence in CBT. There's a link there to get our free newsletter. If you don't know about that, if you can go to that link and subscribe to it. And the link at the bottom is a link to a site on our webpage, which includes a number of different resources that we have in regards to COVID-19. So you're certainly free to visit that. In the first webinar that we did, we talked about first aid, which includes physical needs, safety, family connections. We talked about values, aspirations, and the role of those in setting priorities and goals for callers that you might talk to. We reviewed briefly the cognitive model, and we talked about coping strategies as well as change efforts. So since that time, at the beginning of April, you all have had some more opportunity to take calls and to utilize the things that we talked about at that time. And as I understand, you're running into some challenges as you go along. And Dr. Chang and Dr. Gautam were kind enough to forward some of the kinds of questions and some of the difficult issues that you have as you go along. And so my lecture today is going to be organized around responding to those issues that were brought up. When we get to the Q&A period, we can expand on what I talk about, but we can certainly talk about any other issues that you might be having as well. I'm just using them as a frame to begin the conversation. So one of the first things that poses a challenge is that when the callers call, the first thing they tend to do is apologize for taking up your time. And using a Socratic method for that kind of entree is challenging. And there appears to be quite a bit of guilt and self-blame that goes along with it. Callers have a fear of contracting the illness and passing it on to family members. And how do you deal with that? Callers having pressuring or non-responding administrators. And as I understand, there's a tendency among the volunteers to recognize that there's some validity to the things that the callers are saying. So that brings up the next question, that Socratic questioning is perceived to be used to probe irrational thoughts. But sometimes volunteers will identify with the caller and the thoughts are not thought to be irrational, and then it's difficult to know how to proceed. Callers work in harsh environments and have a lack of options. So how do you talk with them about that? Volunteers have trouble finding alternative options or thought processes to help callers. So I'm hoping the content of my presentation will help with that last point, because I'll go through each one of the points. And so here's my agenda for today. It's to identify when and how to use Socratic questioning, especially in regards to situations when callers are leading off with an apology, callers express a fear of infection, callers' reactions to pressuring administrators. So I will also provide conceptualizations for the caller's issues and illustrate different methods of Socratic questioning to use in dealing with the different presenting problems. And we'll talk a little bit as well about when Socratic questions are not used. So let's talk first about just what is the purpose of Socratic questions. So in CBT, the purpose of the Socratic questions is to explore problems and aspirations and help people draw their own conclusions. So what we don't do is assume that we know what is best for people or what is the right answer or what they should do. We engage in process of asking questions so that we can help them decide based upon their own perspective what they believe is in their best interest. And there is certainly a humanistic aspect to this, in that we believe that callers are capable of drawing those conclusions and deciding what is indeed in their best interest. So let's get right to it then with the apology for taking up your time. Here it is, the response to the apology. Okay, we will try to avoid responding when they say, "Doctor, thank you for being there. I'm so happy. I'm sorry that I have to call you." We try to avoid responding immediately by saying, "No worries, that's why I'm here." And the reason that I would try to avoid doing that is because what that does is keep the focus on the situation itself, about the caller calling in and you being reassuring. So what would be perhaps a more elegant way of responding to that is to go directly to the emotion that is connected to the apology, as opposed to trying to deal with the apology itself. So the first thing that we would do, and indeed, this is right out of the playbook by Carl Rogers. It sounds like you're feeling guilty that you're calling here. So that would be the preferable thing. So we immediately take the focus away from the situation and go right to the experience that they're having as they're calling you. So it puts the focus on the emotion, and it also demonstrates that we understand what they're saying to us at that moment and that we completely accept that that's what they're dealing with. So the reflective statement itself may elicit the automatic thoughts, or we can ask a question like, when you're feeling guilty for calling here, what is the thought that goes through your mind? The caller's response would be that thing that we refer to as an automatic thought. And a typical kind of automatic thought for such a question would be, I should be able to handle this on my own. So this is the way that we would conceptualize this. The situation is that the caller is calling in for help, and the automatic thought that they have is, I should be able to handle this on my own, which is associated with feelings of guilt and shame. And of course, that drives the apology. You will see at the bottom of the slide a reference to a core belief, and I'll talk about the core beliefs toward the end of my presentation. But the one associated here which we think about the core belief providing the structure for all of the other things on the slide, that I'm not competent. I should be able to handle this on my own. So we want to ask questions about the automatic thought. This is what the Socratic process does in this situation. We're going after the thought, not the emotion. We're not asking, why do you feel guilty? And we're not asking about the behavior. We're not asking, why are you apologizing, or telling them that they don't need to apologize. We're just going to go after this. And what I find is really, really helpful is to ask permission. Is it okay if we spend a couple minutes evaluating this thought? After the caller understands that we're going to ask some questions, and after they typically say yes, then they tend not to be as resistive afterwards. So for this and all other kinds of things that I do in my work, I tend to ask for permission because we're going to get into some difficult questions sometimes. So the two kinds of questions that we want to answer: first, what evidence is there from your own experiences that support the idea that you should be able to handle this on your own? And then secondly, what evidence is there from your own experience that does not support that idea? And what we do is we tend to map it out in a way like this. Again, the automatic thought, I should be able to handle this on my own. We begin lining up the evidence in the column on the left side, the evidence that supports that. Well, I'm a smart person. I completed medical school. I'm board certified. I completed fellowships. So all of those things would lend credibility to a person's belief that indeed they're capable of doing problem solving and figuring out a lot of things. That said, however, we also want to think about what evidence from their own experience does not support this. And so this really brings up other kinds of things. Like, even though they went to medical school and are board certified, they don't have any prior training in dealing with a pandemic. They don't have they don't have experience in working out the resources that they need in order to deal with these exceptional challenges. And nobody ever told them that they were going to have to do their work without being able to live with their families. And so these are things that people typically do not think about. They base their automatic thought on the evidence of the column on the left side. This is what supports it. What doesn't support the evidence that doesn't support the thought are the things that people typically are not focused on. So we use this to go through the guided discovery process. And the guided discovery is where we try to get them to use the information that they have to accomplish a cognitive shift in the way that they're thinking about the situation. So if you were to consider all the evidence, that is the evidence that does support your thought and the evidence that does not support your thought, what would be an objective conclusion that you could make? And we would call the response to that. Now, indeed, callers are not necessarily going to immediately put together an alternative automatic thought. And you might have to give them some help in figuring out what would be an objective conclusion to draw from that. And an example would be, although I'm a smart, resourceful person, I was given no preparation for this. And so it only makes sense that I would call for assistance. And indeed, if the caller were to say this statement to themselves, what would be the different experience that they would have? they would feel more calm as opposed to feeling guilty and shamed about calling. And the consequent behavior would be that they would be able to call with a greater degree of comfort. You may get more return callers if indeed they draw this conclusion. So the alternative automatic thought represents a shift in the thinking from I am taking up your time to, although I'm a smart, resourceful person, I was given no preparation for this. So from guilt to calm, and the more adaptive behavior is to make the call with a greater level of comfort. So now let's go to the second situation, the fear of infection. Okay, again, we want to start off with something representative of an empathic statement. So you're afraid because you're in a very high risk setting. So this is not an irrational thought. There is an actual threat. So we're not going to go through the same process that we just did with the last problem, because we're not going to try to convince people that they're not in a high risk setting, and we're not going to try to evaluate, well, how much of a risk is it? And if you put your PPE and wear that correctly, is that going to reduce the risk? We don't get into that. We say, okay, you're in a high risk setting, you're afraid. You know, if they weren't afraid, there would be something a little bit concerning about that. Again, I would ask, is it okay if we talk about the threat that exists? What I often do when I'm talking about things like this, because in just a minute, we're going to go down the valley of death with them. And before we go any further, will you remind me again, why is it that you wanted to be a physician? And a common kind of response would be, I want to help people. Good. And we want them to be able to use that as a kind of an anchor. This is why I'm doing this work when we talk about these other things. So here's our conceptualization for this problem. I work with sick patients. The automatic thought is, I'm going to get sick or spread it to my family. There's fear associated with it. And the kind of behavior could be different in that a person could be too careful, as in an OCD kind of response, that they would be so caught up in trying to be careful that they wouldn't really be functional or helpful on the unit that they're working on, or that they get really careless that, you know, well, they just go with the thought, well, I'm going to get it anyway, so what difference does it make? A core belief that might be supporting this entire structure would be one of helplessness. So with the threat of infection, we ask different kinds of questions. We don't set up the columns the way that we did before, and we don't argue the point or think about it as irrational. We say, you know, it's entirely possible that they would become infected. Now, I know that there are variances depending upon specialty and setting and things like that. No need to get in that. What would be the worst thing that would happen about becoming infected? So we don't say if you become infected, we assume that they could be. And we say, what would be the worst thing if you did become infected? I would spread it to my family and I would die. That would be the worst thing. Okay. What would be the best thing that could happen if you became infected? Well, that it would be mild and I didn't infect anybody else. Okay, because we do know, it's important to remember this as well, that most people who get the virus don't die from it. So we want to make sure that we're considering the range of possibilities, and then we ask, what is the most likely thing that is going to happen? And it's usually something that would fall in between those, considering all the various different possibilities. So if the worst thing were imminent, so we're not going to, again, get into the probabilities or the possibilities here. We're just going to accept that that's a real that could happen, that the person could become infected and spread it to their family. So what is the worst thing if the imminent would happen to you. So there's a range of possibilities. And what would you want to do if that happened? So people will say, I want to make sure that my family knows that I love them. I might want to resolve any conflicts that I have. I might prepare my will, or a long list of other kinds of things. And then we would follow that. I mean, people will have trouble with that because here we're asking them to really accept that this is a real possibility for them. And so we ask, if you did those things, would you be able to find some measure of peace with this? Now, we know from from working with people who have terminal illnesses, that people indeed do this kind of thing every day. It's not pleasant, it's not easy, it won't be easy for you or the caller. But once you get into that, then you're really into problem solving and making decisions and taking action. And when people are able to do that, they feel empowered, they have a sense of self-efficacy, but they would be able to come up with a typical response. If you're able to do that, what would that be? Well, I don't want this to happen, but yeah, I could come to terms with it. So here we have an automatic thought represents a change from I'm going to get sick and spread it to my family, almost as if that is a foregone conclusion, to I don't want that to happen, but even if it did happen, I'd be able to come to terms with it. The shift in thinking is accompanied by a more adaptable attitude of acceptance and a more tolerable feeling of being at peace with it. There are degrees of acceptance and degrees of feeling peace, but we would help them to begin moving in that direction. Okay, then the third situation, pressuring administrators. So what the situation, I'm just making up a situation that probably is happening every hospital in the country. Administrators keep pressuring me to work harder, longer, under unsafe conditions. What is the first thing that goes through your mind when your administrator says something like that? When your administrator was pushing you, what was it? An example would be, they don't care about me. And that would be the automatic thought. They don't care about me. So here are other examples of thoughts that are associated with anger. This isn't fair. I don't deserve this. They knew it was coming. Why didn't they do something? We don't have enough PPE. There are no ventilators. We're running out of meds. They lied to us. So here's our cognitive model for anger. It starts with the situation where you're being pressured by the administrator, and we think of that as a lack of respect. They don't care about me. They're just using me as a pawn, throwing me. They don't care what happens to me. There's just a total lack of appreciation and respect. The first emotion that we have when we are in a situation where we think we're being disrespected is one of hurt, because people do not value us to the degree or in the way that we think that we deserve. And so we feel hurt. And while feeling hurt, as we think about it, you know, this person shouldn't have done this. This is wrong. So there's a violation of a rule. This is not acceptable behavior. And as soon as we go from the hurt to they shouldn't do this, that's when the anger comes. And the anger associated with that, a hostile desire to punish the other person. So there's our conceptualization for what's going on. And specifically with the pressing administrator, the thought, they don't care about me, I'm hurt, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, a range of possible behaviors from passive acceptance to rejection, or active acceptance or rejection. And the core belief associated with this is one of worthlessness. So we explore the thought, they don't care. So again, this is where we begin the Socratic process with this. How much do you believe that they don't care? Let's assume on a scale of 0 to 100, 85%. How angry do you feel at this moment? 90%. Okay. And then I'm going to say, as carefully and caringly as I can, look, I'm not defending the actions of the administrators, but I wonder if there is any other possible explanation for why they behave the way that they do, other than they don't care about me. So this may take a moment for them to try on and to sit with before we can start generating some ideas like this. So we explore the administrators' reasons for being the way they are. Administrators are being pressured by their bosses and government officials to do more with less. Administrators are afraid of becoming infected and spreading. Also, administrators didn't have any training or preparation for this, a concern for public health, a concern that the hospital will just be overrun with sick people. So it is possible that there are other explanations for why they behave the way that they do. So a question is, are those explanations plausible? I think that probably they're true. I think that administrators are on the receiving end of a lot of things as well. So then we want to ask the question, if it's plausible, if you consider all of the possible explanations for the administrator's behavior, how much do you now believe that their behavior, as bad as it may be, is explained solely by the belief that they don't care about you? And again, 0 to 100. And then if you consider all of the possible explanations for the administrator's behavior, how angry do you feel right now? So what we would likely and expect to get would be something like a change in a 0 to 100 rating in terms of a change of belief might go from 85 to 35. A change in the level of anger might go from 90 to 40. Obviously, that's variable. But 85, 35 is, after going through this process, obviously that's not 0. 40 is not 0. But being psychiatrists, I know that you can recognize the significance between a belief of 85% and 35% and 90 and 40 in terms of level of anger. And that would make a significant adjustment in terms of the intensity of the feeling and the person's ability to assume more adaptive behavior. So now I said that I would come back and talk about core beliefs as we got further through this. So we talked about 3 different core beliefs. One is I'm not competent. One, I'm helpless. One, I'm worthless. Okay. Now, in 1 hour or in 1 session model that you're using with your callers, I would tend not to get into core beliefs. I wouldn't explore them because they're more complicated and they're are likely to trigger off a whole bunch of things that you are not really going to be in a position to be able to follow up on. So that would be, but you might hear words like that. And if you do hear words like that, you might use that as a reason to make or to recommend that they engage in therapy, because if their core beliefs are interfering with their ability to answer your questions or to engage in the conversation, then there's something much more powerful going on. And in your 1 session model, you may not have the time or the resources to deal with it. Now, that said, I do think that there's some value in at least talking about, for instance, incompetence. So Merriam and Webster define incompetence as lacking the qualities needed for effective action. So that becomes very important when you think about, do you personally lack the qualities needed, or is the situation and the lack of resources unprecedented and overwhelming for you and for other people? And if you are uncertain about what to do in these extreme situations for which you have no training or experience, does that mean that you're incompetent? So it kind of comes down to, does uncertainty equal incompetence? And if we just use a standard dictionary definition, it doesn't measure up that way. And so when you hear those kinds of words and you want to have something to say about it, you could engage in these that are rather Socratic and guided to help a person to just think differently about how they're defining incompetence without going into the evidence from their life that supports it or doesn't support it. So another thing that was brought up in the initial questions for the agenda today was the harsh environment, that they work in a harsh environment. So that is absolutely true. So again, that is not a cognitive distortion. They really do work in a harsh environment. And so again, just like when we talked about working in a situation where they're have a realistic fear of infection, we establish again the reason for the person being in the profession and establish that they really do want to stay in the profession. And again, I use that as a kind of an anchor. And so instead of going into the thoughts, because we're not thinking about this as a cognitive distortion, we're not going to try to convince them that it's not a harsh environment. So what we do at this point is work with coping strategies. So what are coping strategies that will help you to get along and to function in this harsh environment? Or what are those things that you can change in order to bring about personal change? So some of the coping strategies, we talked about these in the first webinar, and most of you are familiar with them anyway. So things like relaxation, mindfulness, meditations, emotional regulation, those other things from CBT. So those are coping strategies that you can use to just live with the harsh environment. Again, this is an example of something where we're not using Socratic questions. And then what do we change in a harsh environment? Well, we know that when you're in the environment that is harsh toward you, there's very little oftentimes that we can do to change the reality of the situation. And so we're very limited in what we can change, but there are some things that we can change about ourselves that will help us to get along better in spite of the fact that we're in a harsh environment. And cost-benefit analysis, doing some problem solving, activity scheduling. How am I spending my time? Are there better ways that I can spend some of my time? What am I doing in terms of my interpersonal effectiveness? Am I standing up for my rights appropriately? Am I respecting other people's rights? And when I talk with them, am I using an appropriate tone of voice, gestures, postures, eye contact, those kinds of things, so that they respect me and take me seriously. So in regards to any of the strategies that we've talked about, what we will do oftentimes is set up a behavioral experiment to test whether or not the coping strategy or the skills are actually helpful. So the behavioral experiments, go out, try this, see if this will help you to feel better, see if this will help you to be more adaptive. Does it give you any more coping ability? The behavioral experiments give you the corrective information for cognitive distortions. And then we would ask, if indeed you're able to use one of these strategies or skills, and it is helpful, what does it mean about you that you were able to make these changes on your own? And the answer to that question represents a change in the person's beliefs about themselves, their self-efficacy, and their ability to manage life. So let me summarize. What we talked about was when and how to use Socratic questioning, especially in situations where callers are leading off with an apology, callers have fear of infection, callers are reacting to pressuring administrators. I showed you some conceptualizations for how we put those things into formulation, and we illustrated different methods of Socratic questioning, so it isn't always the same process for each different presenting issue. And then we just talked about some situations where Socratic questions are not used. Just for your resources, here are a few links to the main Beck Institute website, again, COVID-19, and a couple of other articles that have been written in regards to physicians and the issues that physicians are dealing with in the frontline situations. So I am, I think, close to, or at least I'm out of time. So I really appreciate your sticking with it, listening, and I look forward to your questions and hope that we can have a good discussion here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Miller. Give us a very informative lecture again. It's very practical as well. We greatly appreciate. So we go to the next session, which is a Q&A, and so I'll hand it to Dr. Smita Galton to handle that. Thanks.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. You will see a Q&A box on the Zoom app. If you click on it and type your question, that would be great. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. And I want to remind myself and our attendees that we are wearing different hats during these calls with our peer physicians. And sometimes we may have our CBT therapist hat on, and other times we may just have a peer friend hat on. And it may or may not feel appropriate or may feel tone deaf to get into one of the tools that Dr. Miller has talked about. What he has presented, and he said this before too in the last session, that these are all the tools that are at our disposal that we can pick and choose from. And because our work is unique, it's not a dedicated therapy session. We may decide whether we want to, something like a question comes up just exactly how Dr. Miller has said, and we may decide not to go with Socratic questioning or advantages and disadvantages. What the reason we are bringing this up is also to sort of therapize ourselves, because when we listen to those things, we might just get carried away with their thought processes and lose the ability to, be really supportive and problem solve with them. Dr. Miller, any comments on that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And as psychiatrists, I believe in your ability to differentiate between when is it appropriate to use these kinds of tools or techniques and when it should take a different approach. So just by way of explanation, I'm presenting the things that I presented in order to give you the tools.
Yes.
I am not presenting any of them to say you should use them with any particular caller at any particular time. I think it is absolutely appropriate for you to decide whether you want to respond to the caller as being a friend, a colleague. It is also entirely appropriate to listen. Some people will want, I'm guessing that some of your callers will just want to talk. And being an empathic listener and reflecting what you're hearing can be extremely powerful and helpful to people. And I would absolutely encourage you, because, I don't want to go down in the weeds with the research, but people are working in situations where it isn't even a past trauma that we're talking about. People are experiencing ongoing trauma. And so what we want to do is be a support to them. And we want to give them whatever it is that they're looking for that's going to help them to go back and walk through the front door again tomorrow. And just being empathic and reflective and supportive many times is going to be the best and most appropriate thing. And just one more point, again, referring to research, we don't want to over-therapize people when they're being traumatized. If we try to get them into therapy too much while there's ongoing trauma, there's an equal chance that we will do more harm than good. So I think that this question and statement is a really important one, that we want to strike a balance between being supportive and helping people to change. Not everybody wants to change, and it is not our position to tell them that they should change. Only that we have the techniques available to us in case that's something that seems appropriate at the time.
I see one question. What's the difference between, how do you define Socratic questioning as opposed to any other kinds of questioning?
Oh, well, so kind of at the beginning of my presentation, I gave a kind of an operational definition. Maybe I can get back to that for you. So I structured this to be an an operational definition. Here we are. So within CBT, the Socratic question in CBT is designed to help people to explore and evaluate their problems or their aspirations, to help them to draw different conclusions. So there is a stated purpose in using this Socratic questions to take a person through the guided discovery process. So the intended purpose of this is to help people to explore all of the facts of a situation so that they can take all of the facts, all of the evidence into consideration and draw their own conclusions about what is right for them, what's not right for them, what they want to do or don't want to do. We let them draw their own conclusions. So with this Socratic questions and guided discovery within CBT, there's a very specific purpose to it, as opposed to questions that might show interest, might show concern, might demonstrate other kinds of things, but would not have the specific purpose of trying to help them to think differently about it and to draw their own conclusions about it. So am I saying that Socratic questions are superior to other kinds of questions? No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that for this specific purpose, Socratic questions and guided discovery will be more likely to help you to get there in an efficient and a helpful way. But clearly, other questions are valuable for many other reasons. I'm sorry, I can't hear
Smita,
you.
Smita, you need to unmute yourself.
Myself, yes. So Carol says, thank you. Both of your lectures have been interesting and helpful. While I can see using these techniques in a single session, I would feel more comfortable setting it up with a brief explanation of why we are shifting into this mode. So rather than just ask, can we explore that thought? Can you offer a 2-sentence summary of CBT to let the caller know why we think it might be valuable?
So if I understand the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, why is it that we think that CBT might be helpful in this situation?
Dr. Miller, it might also be, and Carol, feel free to follow up with a follow-up question.
Oh,
so we're changing when we move from that peer hat to CBT hat, the caller may not be in that, just to cue them in. Can we say something more than, can we, do I have your permission to like
talk? Your permission to talk about it. Absolutely. So let me respond to that maybe before I forget. So if a person is expressing extremes in mood or having really trouble saying, you know, how do I deal with my administrator? They just don't listen. They don't pay any attention. They don't care. They just come in and start. So I think an appropriate kind of introduction would be to say, you know, I don't know if it's what you're looking for right now, but we do have techniques, we have procedures, we have skills and coping strategies that we know that we use for people in therapy. And although this isn't formally a therapy session, there are things that we have. Would you be interested in talking about what some of those things are, with the potential that you might want to use them? And I can tell you how to use them, or we can practice how to talk with your administrator or whatever. So I think that's the way I would segue. I wouldn't say, well, I absolutely would not say when somebody is having any kind of problem, presenting with any kind of problem, I wouldn't just automatically go into this stuff without saying, well, you know, we have some tools, we have stuff. If you're interested, we can talk about what they are. And we can go, if you want, as far as we can in this one session. And this one session might be enough for you. Or you might find that you want something more than this. And if you would want something more from this, either today or you can call back later and we can give you a referral to somebody if you would like to go and explore these things further. Does that, I'm not sure. Did I answer the question?
Yes, Dr. Miller, it did.
Okay.
Especially the first part. The way you like structured it while saying it aloud, that was really helpful.
I think, well, thank you. When doing webinars, but also when talking with patients or callers in this case, I find that it's really helpful to explain people why I'm doing or asking them or bringing something up. People respond to me much more positively when I'm explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, rather than just saying, okay, do this. And I say that isn't something that I would say that is necessarily related to CBT. That's just been my experience through having lots of problems in therapy over the decades that, you know, I've made so many mistakes. I just find that, you know, there are certain kinds of things like that are just really helpful in improving the therapeutic relationship, or in this case, the caller relationship. I think that people just really appreciate the humanness, and I think that they feel valued if we explain to them what and why we're thinking and why we're suggesting what we're suggesting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Cheng is saying, someone to us, Rachel, someone might not know how to type question and answer or raise hand. Maybe we can unmute and ask whoever has questions. That's appropriate, I think, because I don't see any unanswered questions yet. So let's do a trial of this. I'm going to invite at least some of you to unmute yourselves and ask a question. If you have not been able to ask it because you're on a phone or are not able to type for any other reason. We'll try to see whether, if our tech person sees that you are unmuted, she'll, and several people are unmuted, she will help out with that.
So unfortunately, in the webinar format, attendees cannot unmute themselves. So we do have to go through the Q&A box, which is just the box on the bottom with two little bubbles. That's where you submit your question. So just the format of this.
There are people on phone.
So for the, on a phone, they wouldn't be able to raise their hand. Is there a specific attendee that you know that has a question?
No, I am not hearing. If people have any questions and want to text me on 216-702-1012.
I can open up the chat if people would rather type in there, but unfortunately, I'd have to individually go in and unmute everybody. So unless I know specifically who has a question, I wouldn't be able to, unless I just unmute everybody.
I see. So maybe I can ask the question on, so, hey, Dr. Miller, again, thanks a lot for, very informative, lecture. I recall in the lecture you mentioned about one thing that, try not to focus on the core belief, so because that, I think it's especially for our setting that we're mostly in a kind of hotline setting and has a very, short, encounter period of time, and in most of the situation it will be only a one-time contact, so I think that might be, my assumption that might be one of the reasons. But you also mentioned about, if during the conversation it does touch a little bit about core belief, and then how we be able to encounter this situation, how we are able to steer it in the right direction, not only fit into that setting, but also can actually further the conversation and serve the purpose for us to help the caller. So would you possibly elaborate a little bit on these? Thanks.
Yeah, just let me clarify that we wouldn't talk at length or try to work to get people to change their core beliefs in this kind of situation with a caller. But I think that there are things that we can do to just sort of talk about the core belief and explore with the caller whether or not that would be something that they would want to explore further. And I think I said that in that kind of situation, I would more likely feel comfortable referring them so that they could engage in therapy, because there are, there are a couple ways to think about it, I guess. One is that with the core beliefs that we usually run into in situations like this are ones of helplessness, or believing that they're incompetent, that they can't deal with it, or helpless in this situation, or worthless when they're being treated in a disrespectful way. So core beliefs are different from the automatic thoughts. When we went through the automatic thoughts, we said there's this, we use Socratic questions to evaluate them, but all of the questions that we're evaluating or asking to use to evaluate the belief are very focused on the present time and focused very specific to the situation or the problem that they're presenting. Core beliefs are different from that, because core beliefs are the kind of beliefs that we develop about ourselves, about other people, about the future, And those beliefs are built over oftentimes long periods of time, sometimes from childhood. And the kinds of evidence that people come up with to explain, what is the evidence that you're worthless? Well, when they start saying that, well, back to when I was 3 years old, my father told me I was no good, I would never amount to anything. And so, if we're going from an adult back to somebody who was abused in their childhood, or if we consider any of the other adverse childhood experiences that people have, that's more than we're going to be able to handle in a single conversation on the phone. And so we're not going to expound on that, and we're not going to get into it. We would talk with them so we could, I think probably in addition to the kinds of couple of questions that I suggested asking, I think that doing some reflective listening and demonstrating empathy that, it sounds like you really had a hard life. There are a lot of things that have happened to you. You might say, have you ever pursued therapy? Have you ever thought about that? Is that something that you would consider? So in that situation, what we might be doing would be exploring the possibility and some decision making about whether or not to get into treatment to deal with the issues that they've been having. And so we bring it from the problems of childhood back to the present time so that we can just deal with what is a decision or an action that could be taken or made right now that would have a positive impact on those things that happened a long time ago. So I would try to keep it in the present time as much as possible, because if we go far into the past and into people's childhood, it's just going to be way more than we're going to be able to appropriately deal with in a call like this. So did I answer your question?
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Miller. So I, if I understand correctly, you mean that it's not like this thing is not, important. The core belief and automatic thoughts, they're actually different level and, of the issue and, linked together. But it's just not feasible or appropriate to be dealt in this current session, in this current situation. I think, based on, my experience when dealing with the, healthcare workers, they're helping them doing crisis intervention, for these healthcare workers in Wuhan. We actually had, encountered a similar situation that I think it's important to kind of clear demarcate that, for us doing crisis intervention comparing to the regular therapy, issues that for our current situation doing crisis intervention, that's not a suitable environment to deal with this core belief. And just as an analogy, we're more like a, like a emergency, ER physician settings, as an analogy, such as if a patient has COPD coming and has a shortness of breath, the ER doctor just treat it symptomatically instead of treating the COPD itself in that sense, as a, based, underneath the situation which they will refer to primary care physician to deal with it later on. So it's kind of as an analogy.
I think that's a great metaphor, and I think that that's exactly right.
All right, thanks, Todd. Yeah. Smita.
Yeah, and I am not seeing any more questions, but I am seeing some thank yous. Jean said, thank you so much. This was super helpful once again. Bettina says, thank you for not avoiding talking about the fear of death. That was so important. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Miller.
Okay.
When I have a new message, people are just saying thank yous to you.
It's
all right. Wonderful.
My pleasure.
I think we're on time this time.
Okay, we're on time this time? Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate Dr. Miller and Beck Institute for continuing supporting us, for this very, meaningful work. We'll try our best to help all physicians at the front line, and also thanks for our volunteers to participate and donate their time and effort into it. Greatly appreciate. Now, I think there's previously an attendee asking these questions. So the recording of our previous lecture is already on the YouTube channel, right? The Beck Institute YouTube channel. I assume these, recording will be uploaded later on as well. Then we're, once we get the link, then we'll forward to our volunteers.
Yeah, what has happened is we sort of inducted about 115 new volunteers this morning.
Wow.
And some of those people have joined in. I avoided sending them the webinar link because it was just too much information all in few hours. But some of them have been able to join in, and this might be the first thing that they're hearing from Physician Support Line about the work. And so there are a lot of questions, and there might be confusion about, so reiterating one more time, we are learning tools that we may or may not decide to use. The peer support and listening remains the foundation of our work.
Yeah, that's right. So let me start again by saying thank you to you for inviting me back. Thank you to all of you for volunteering your time and doing this really, really important work. And my effort here has been to try to give you some additional tools that you can add to the many things that you already know how to do. And using your best professional judgment, will decide what will be the best thing to do with each caller as you're engaged with them. And sometimes it will be using some of the techniques that we've discussed here, and sometimes it will be something completely different. Indeed, when people are in trauma, experiencing trauma, that is not the time that traditional psychotherapy is going to be most helpful to them. I talked about this briefly in the first session, and that is when people are being traumatized or even after a trauma, a kind of psychological first aid is the kind of thing that is going to be most important to make sure that they're in a safe environment, that they have shelter, that they have clothing, and that they have connections with their families and friends. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be most helpful and most important to help people to get through from day to day. So keeping that in mind and using that as the foundation and the context for everything else, some of the techniques that we've talked about here today and to some extent last time, those are things that are kind of additional icing on the cake, if you will, when you consider that it's appropriate and you need something additional. But don't confuse this with traditional psychotherapy. Traditional psychotherapy, when people are being traumatized or immediately thereafter, I would consider to be an inappropriate use of psychotherapy. But at the same time, there are techniques and tools that we can pick and choose from, and using your professional judgment, there might be something here that would be helpful to you when you're working with the callers. And it would be my hope that there is. I again thank you for inviting me to be back. It's a great pleasure to be able to do this. I wish you well in the work. I should probably offer as well, since not everybody who is listening was able to ask Q&A, we can figure out a system. But if you have questions that you wish to ask that you weren't able to, if you would send them maybe to Dr. Chang or Dr. Gautam, that they could forward them to me, and I would be more than happy to respond to questions that come up after we formally close the webinar.
Yes, sure. So yeah, for the listeners who's have any additional questions, feel free to send email to me or to Smita so we can forward to Dr. Miller. So again, Dr. Miller, thanks a lot for your time and effort again in the weekend and to give us this wonderful lecture. We really appreciate. Also, thanks for Rachel to arrange that for us. Again, thanks for backing to continue supporting us. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.